All right, so it's a little different topic today. We're going to talk about, of course, the sustainability aspects of the North American floriculture supply chain. And well, I don't know about you, but I've taken 2 pages worth of notes already today. And I know not to say plastic waste. I'm now going to use the term plastics with residual value. Is that good, Savannah? All right, good. Yeah, awesome. And so I too have the proverbial introductory graph showing, of course, the exhaustive and expansive use of plastics, and that's both good and bad. Whenever I ask students, is this a good thing or is that a bad thing? And I say, yes. All right, it is a conundrum. And of course, in the States, one issue has really raised the whole exposure to sustainability in plastics, and that's the use of plastic straws. I mean, that one issue has just raised so much attention. And of course, you can see in this particular pie chart that about 2/3 of the consumers actually say that they would they support not using plastic straws anymore. And another 16% in the red there, they say that it's that they would oppose a ban on plastic straws. But again, my point is that this particular issue has caused a lot of attention, and because again, we're thinking of it as plastic waste. Now we know our error, right? Now, in the States, there's also a green business survey that's conducted every single year. There's a couple of statistics that I want to point out. The one on the left is that the natural capital costs, and what I mean by that is the externalities of companies that are producing products. The cost, the externalities to the environment total about $4.1 trillion. Now, just to clarify, because we use billions and millions and trillions interchangeably, and we know it's a big number. I want to tell you how big a trillion is. If you were to count, let's just say if you were to count to 1 billion, how long would it take you? 32 years. 32 years. You don't believe me? Go ahead and try it. To count to 1 trillion, assuming you could count one number every second, it would take you 36,000 years. So the natural cost to the environment of companies producing in the United States, $4.1 trillion. We have a $20 trillion economy. So you can do the math. That's about 20% of our annual economy in terms of the externalities imposed on the environment from that $20 trillion economy. It's significant. That's why this is an issue. That's why we're here. And quite frankly, the U.S. has been lagging behind much of the rest of the world, but we're starting to catch up, and I'll talk about that. Now, there's a very clear path to sustainability. Again, I know it's the afternoon, and I got to pull out all the stops, so to keep you awake and laughing. So this is kind of a roadmap to sustainability. There's a lot of different pathways that you can take to get there, because the single question that's been common from all the speakers this morning and this afternoon is how, right? We know what to do. We have an inkling of why we're doing it, but how we get there, that's where you see the many paths that we take. And of course, in the States, if you look at floral consumption, this is the flowers, seeds, and potted plants, and it's been an upward curve, with the exception of the Great Recession that you see the dip there. And yet, since the recession, we've seen a resurgence of floral consumption. That's both good, but it also means that we're using a lot more plastics as well. All right. Now, this is a supply chain diagram, and I don't put this in here that you actually be able to read it. It's just simply to show the complexity of the supply chain. And it starts down to bottom with manufacturers and distributors, and then the circle there in the middle, the yellow circle, is growers, And then the growers are selling product either through the retail channels or through the landscape service sector. And then you have the consumer there at the top. So it's a very complex value chain, industry-wide value chain. We're in the mature stage of our industry life cycle, which means that the competitive advantages that companies employed to get through the Great Recession are not the same competitive advantages that's going to make them successful in the future. So they have to do other things. Well, we're going to talk about what those other things are, because in the States, traditionally, you look at all the business case studies for the last 50 years, and up until a decade ago, folks always deemed sustainability to be a cost. As we were talking about yesterday and this morning, it's an investment. And in fact, it's a route to cost savings within the business, not necessarily an imposition on cost or an added cost. It can be an added cost, but the net returns in the long run are vastly outweigh those particular costs. All right? So we're going to go through this supply chain. We're going to start with manufacturers and distributors. And what have they done in terms of being more sustainable? Well, much of that has been done has been in product development. And you look at the basic strategies, product development, we're very prolific at coming up with new products. And even for flowers using floral foam, Smithers Oasis now has a biodegradable foam, and so being more sustainable is incumbent, because at some point, folks are going to quit throwing away floral foam after they use cut flowers, and sooner or later, a way is going to fill up. And so that's the demand underlying those particular products. And of course, there's some other examples. Wait a minute. All right, there's the floral foam. I forgot about this slide that I threw in here at the last second. This is a furniture manufacturer. This is Ethan Allen, a furniture manufacturer. All right, and this is, you can't read this, but so I'll read it. At Ethan Allen, we believe that sustainable and ethical practices aren't exceptional. They're just good business. We started working toward a greater good before green was all the rage, and our efforts have helped us become leaders in environmentally responsible manufacturing. A furniture manufacturer. And I show this during my presentations at various green industry audiences, and I say, wait a minute, we're supposed to be the green industry, and yet other industries are showing us up. All right, so, but our industries are catching up, as I said, and I showed you the example, and I told you about that, Smithers Oasis biodegradable foam. We're now using wood chips instead of petroleum-based fuels to heat our greenhouses. You see examples down here. We're even making pots out of cow manure, of all things. It's not very popular, but we are using different types of products. I'll come back to that here in a little bit. So the manufacturing sector is doing what it can, even to get away from agrochemicals, using bio-based pesticides in order to control insects and diseases. All right, now let's talk about growers. Growers, too, have been very proactive. Again, this is a website of one of our growers in the Midwest. It's a sizable operation, one of the leaders in our industry. But you can see that they, too, are doing what they can to talk about sustainable planting and what deems a sustainable landscape. And how does that translate into consumer purchases? Talking about their native plants and the recycling that they do at the farm level. And the fact that they are a green building supplier. So they're working in conjunction with the Green Building Council and supplying plants for green roofs and so forth that we talked about yesterday. They're utilizing solar energy, using biofuels, conserving water. All of these are practices that are more sustainable than traditional nursery and greenhouse production has ever been in the States. So we're doing things a little bit differently. Now, going back to a discussion we had earlier about carbon footprint, and several of our speakers alluded to the fact that we've got to take a look at an in-depth analysis of the carbon footprint at each step of our value chain, because then we can identify the areas where the low-hanging fruit is, where we can make improvement. So for the past 8 years, I've been working with a colleague at the University of Kentucky and looking at the carbon and water footprint of nursery and greenhouse production. Now, this is before that was even really mentioned, but I knew when Walmart instituted their 15-point sustainable guidelines, which they asked all their vendors to fill out 15 different questions on how they are sustainable, I knew the handwriting was on the wall, because Walmart's the 900-pound gorilla in the U.S., and as Walmart goes, so does the rest of the retail sector. So I knew at some point we would have to have information available to us regarding our carbon footprint and our water footprint, and we did not want to be lacking in that information when it occurred. So we embarked on several different studies. First of all, we looked at the carbon footprint relative to other products. I always like comparing it to a six-pack of beer, because we compare rather favorably with most of our products. And I always compare it to a gallon of milk, because we all drink milk. And you'll see here in a second, we still compare very favorably, and among other products. All right, so to do this carbon footprinting, you have to do a life cycle analysis. And I know that most of you are really aware of what a life cycle analysis is. But basically imagine every single activity in the nursery or greenhouse from propagation all the way to shipping it out the gate. That every single activity is monitored. And every material that's used, I'm talking every single material is used, and we map the life cycle of that material and where it originated and determine its carbon footprint. So if we use a fertilizer, we have databases of the carbon footprint for fertilizers. We look at every chemical that's used, all the equipment that's used in terms of the fuel usage. And then we use we calculate the energy inputs that are needed to run the equipment. And then labor. And of course, labor is typically about 35 to 40% of total cost. The interesting thing is that there is a strong correlation between cost and carbon footprint. And so what's really unique is that there have been other carbon footprint studies that have been conducted, but this is the first time that we've incorporated economics into that research. So this is the first research of its kind. So we looked at different species of plants. We looked at a red maple, for example. A redbud right here in the field production of red maple. The interesting thing about field production, there's no containers. So when you map all the activities and you generate this life cycle analysis and you see the carbon footprint for every single activity, most of the activity is here at harvest and really loading and unloading those trees once they're harvested. Because you have these large digging machines, and so they're out there hours upon hours and they're digging. And then you've got skid steers moving these trees and loading them on the truck and so forth. So there's a lot of fossil fuels used in those activities. Therefore, they represent most of the carbon footprint. It's on the back end of the production cycle. Right? Now contrast that to a 25-gallon tree that's grown in a pot and pot production system. Now, pot and pot is where you have what's called a moat pot that's in the ground. You put a container in the ground, and then you put the tree that's containerized inside the container in the ground. So it keeps the tree from falling over. It provides a buffering of temperatures for the roots. And so it's a very nice production system, because then you can pull the tree out of the ground because it's in the other pot, and you don't have to dig it, you don't have to burlap it, you don't have to use a lot of those fossil fuels. However, now you've got 2 containers made of plastic in this system. All right, so when you take a look at that particular system, obviously the insert container is a big part of the carbon footprint, as well as the substrate. All right, then if we look at even smaller size, let's go down to a 3-gallon container. right? This is basically a medium-sized shrub, right? So we talked about field trees, container trees. We're going smaller to a 3-gallon shrub. In this case, again, the container is a big part of the carbon footprint, along with the liner and also fertilization. We go even smaller to young plant production, plugs. And we see the tray, which is the purple area right here, again, a big part of that carbon footprint, right? And along with the electricity and heating of the greenhouses for growing those young plants. Now, you put it all together, and with all the different types of materials that we studied, and you can see that the carbon footprint varies, and we're measuring that, of course, in carbon, CO2 equivalents, and then we're comparing that against the CO2 that is sequestered during the life of those particular products, right? And we're measuring the cost, right? So if you consider all the carbon that's sequestered, a red maple tree right here sequesters 650 kilograms of CO2 equivalents during its life when it's planted in the landscape. All right, so we assumed not just it went to the farm gate, we went out to a 60-year time period when that tree is still alive in the landscape, and measured the carbon that is sequestered during the useful life of that tree, the useful life of the shrubs, and so forth. And so then we can compare all the carbon that's sequestered during its life with all the carbon that was all the CO2 equivalents that were generated in producing those trees, shrubs, and flowers, and we can see if we have a net positive or a net negative carbon footprint. And so as you look down here, obviously you look at numbers like this, and that's a lot bigger than the 12.5 kilograms of CO2 equivalent that we produced during while producing the tree. All right, so we're a net positive there. All right, if you go down to deciduous shrub 11 and 9, we got deciduous shrubs right here. We're well above, so we're still a net positive. Right? It's only when you get into begonias and annual plants, when you had a substantial carbon footprint in producing it versus the lifespan in the landscape, that would come out to a negative carbon footprint. All right, so that's why when I said yesterday, we don't need to start pointing fingers at turf grass or start pointing fingers at flowers and say the tree folks are good and the shrub folks are good, but all these annual bedding plants, they got to go because they're a net negative carbon footprint. We can't do that. We have to start talking about landscape systems. So in the carbon footprint work, now that we've gone through all of these different individual plants and different sizes, the next step then is to look at landscape systems. If you have a typical 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, and it has a landscape with evergreen shrubs and deciduous trees and curvilinear beds, we'll take the typical suburban landscape and we'll model that, and we'll actually determine the landscape, the carbon footprint for the landscape system, which will be vastly positive. And so that will be vital information if and when the time comes that we have to justify our existence. Because there's 2 different ways in which horticulture faces a dilemma. And one is in terms of our sustainability and relative to our carbon footprint. And if we have too negative a carbon footprint, we're going to get a lot of pressure about that. But I just showed you, if we consider a landscape system, we really won't have to worry about that because we have it documented. But the other area is in terms of our water footprint. And there's certain parts of the world right now in which water is more scarce than any other commodity, more scarce than oil. We have certain parts in the States. California just went through a major drought. And when it comes down to making a decision about watering people or watering plants, the people will win every time. So that's why we can't simply talk about plants are pretty and plants are aesthetically pleasing to us, we got to talk about the functionality of plants, the economic benefits, the environmental ecosystem services benefits, and the health and well-being benefits. And when we do that, we justify our existence, we justify our share of the water, and we justify ourselves in terms of the mind of the environmentally conscious consumer that says, thou shalt be more sustainable. And indeed, we can demonstrate that we are, from a carbon footprint perspective and from a global warming potential perspective, that we are part of the solution and not part of the problem. But if we were not armed with this information, we would have we would have our suppositions to go on. And of course, that's not going to last too long in a policy-making situation. So we have to be armed with this information and then use that to our advantage. So there's a lot of power, a lot of circles of influence in this particular room. So these are the data that you and your circles of influence should be going back and talking about in terms of our positive carbon footprint. All right, so what are we learning? Knowing more about carbon footprint and variable costs helps managers increase efficiency, period. They find that they save cost. By paying attention to carbon footprint and measuring costs associated with it, they too find those areas where they can be more efficient. A few inputs and processes in production account for most of the carbon footprint. In other words, it's not really a carbon-intensive process except in its various points and various materials that are used. And then life cycle ecosystem services greatly outweigh the greenhouse gas emissions during production. And then lastly, the industry should market this. We should be screaming this in Spanish and French and German and all the other languages that we can as loudly as we can, because we should be very proud of that. Because if we neglect to do that, no one is going to do that for us. No one is going to do that for us. But they will point a finger at us unless we cut them off at the pass. So we cut them off that argument early on. So we look at landscape systems. So the landscape sector in the States is actually doing a very good job of promoting its sustainability. We've developed a set of standards called the Sustainable Sites Initiative, oftentimes just referred to as SITES. And those standards are now widely accepted as the standards for what defines a sustainable landscape. Because as I said earlier, when you start looking at individual components, it's hard to tell. But now they have a system developed that you can get points, whether or not you use a peat-based media in producing plants, whether or not it's a certain size tree that sequesters a certain amount of carbon. So you get all these credits, and just like the LEED certification by the Green Building Council, you can achieve a platinum status. In fact, there's great synergy between LEED certification and the CITES certification, as you might imagine. Many of the same people are working on those same standards. They're at each other's table when they're making those decisions. Now, I don't always agree with every single decision that they make. From a horticultural standpoint, they don't like bedding plants too much because of their carbon intensity. But they recognize that there's very few landscapes, or you're not going to have bedding plants or annual plants, right? So this CITES initiative and the landscape architects. So we were talking a while ago, our landscape architects that are in a room, they're very proactive. The ASLA, American Society of Landscape Architects, is very proactive in talking about case studies that they have gone in and measured the sustainability of these landscapes. And they've been very successful at demonstrating the sustainability of both municipal landscapes and residential landscapes. So that's the kind of information that we need to get to the end user and also to policymakers. Now, garden centers. It's a mixed bag. All right? And garden centers are a conundrum to begin with. And if you're a garden center operator, I'm not trying to step on your toes. It's just that we have really, really, really good ones. And here in Europe, you have a lot of good ones. But we have some good ones, and then we got some that are just mediocre. All right, so it's really a mixed bag. But those that are doing it right, of course, have sustainable initiatives. This is one of our premier garden centers, and they talk about the composting that they do. They talk about their solar. They talk about their water management. Again, water, this company is located in an area of the country where they don't have to worry about water. And yet they talk about water management because they recognize its importance in terms of policy making. And, of course, even our departments of transportation within our respective states are looking at ways in which we can be more sustainable, even in our roadside plantings. And you may remember Lyndon Baines Johnson was president in the 60s, and his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, she was a wildflower fanatic. And so she put together a national roadside wildflower planting program. And so when you come and visit in Texas, which I hope you do sometime, right? Everybody should come to Texas at least once in their life, right? Because you haven't lived unless you do. So you should come to Texas, and when you come to Texas, make sure it's in April and May, because you won't like it too much any other time, right? So come in April and May, and that's what you're going to see. You're going to see wildflowers everywhere you look. It's phenomenal. But this reduces mowing considerably for our Texas roadsides, right? So there's a lot of mowing that goes on because we have literally millions of miles of roads within the state of Texas. And, of course, our botanic gardens are getting into the act of trying to educate consumers about what sustainable gardening really is, how to capture rainwater, how to compost, what types of plant materials to use for the right plant for the right place. So those kinds of educational efforts are being very fruitful. Our gardening clubs, the same way. This is the National Gardening Club website, and they're talking about minimizing the impact on the environment. But you see, when that's got to be information that we generate and that we populate so that they're disseminating the right information. Now, consumers, again, a mixed bag. In the States, we have a LOHAS consumer, lifestyle of health and sustainability. That's about 13%. Those are the 13% that just get it. They're sustainable, and they didn't even know it. They may not even be able to spell sustainability, but they think it and they live it because that's just their nature. Other consumers, not so much. The Food Marketing Institute conducted a survey, and they looked at the millennials, and 32% of millennials claim to be very green, which is very surprising because in the courses that I teach, 100% of them would say that they're very green. They're very environmentally conscious. And then, of course, matures came in at 40%. It's the consumer, though, we have to satisfy. Now, look at this lady's face. Is that a delighted consumer? I don't think so. That's a confused consumer. First off, she's probably confused at all the different brands, and then she may be confused at the plastic she sees relative to the plants that she sees. So I want to go through very quickly a biodegradable container study that I conducted because we've been talking about plastics. I said, okay, what about other types of containers and what is the consumer acceptance of those containers? So just I'll get through the preface here. I looked at rice hull pots. I looked at wheat starch pots. That's the green one here on the right. And then looked at straw pots. And we looked at willingness to pay relative to a standard 4-inch black plastic pot. Now, the interesting thing is, and my fellow social scientist here, Dr. Beck, will agree with me, when you ask consumers, are they willing to do something, chances are when you're surveying them, they will tell you the answer that they want you to hear. And so I don't know if you know this or not, but sometimes people don't always do what they say they're going to do. And so those are stated preferences. So we have developed some more sophisticated research tools, conjoint analysis, but even more so, experimental auctions in this case, in which I actually give the people participating in this experiment cold hard cash. I give them money. If they don't use it, they can take it home. So we run an experimental auction. I won't bore you with all the details, but basically it helps us get to a revealed preference. Because when people are willing to turn loose their cash, they're revealing something to you. All right, so it's a revealed preference. Now we're using eye tracking and biometrics. We put special glasses on folks, and we walk them through the garden center and see where they're looking. We're seeing what colors attract them. And then in the lab, we have a human behavior lab at Texas A&M. We put biometric sensors on temples, the neck, and so forth, measure pulse rate. And so we can not only see where you're looking, but how you're feeling, what part of the brain is being triggered as you're looking at that particular plant. So now we can figure out, are you looking at it just because, for a long time, because you like it? Or you think, who in the world developed that color? That's the ugliest color on earth. You're still looking at it for a long time, and in the past, we would correlate those purchases to length of time that we were looking at it. But there wasn't a perfect correlation. But now we can kind of slice that a little bit deeper by looking at, most purchasing decisions are in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. So we can tell which part of the brain is being triggered when you're looking at that particular plant. So it's really cool and leading edge research. But for this one, I used experimental auctions. And folks identified, they actually bought the plants. And by doing that, now, some people, when you take them to an auction, they've got to win. They get auction fever. So we have a ninth price auction or a third price auction. We vary it, we randomize it. So it's not always the highest bidder that wins. But anyway, let me get to the results. When you compare against a standard black plastic pot, the rice hull pot commanded a 58-cent premium. Then standard to a black plastic pot, the straw pot commanded a 37-cent premium. The wheat pot, a 23-cent premium over the same flower, right? And I'll go back to my picture. You notice that the flowers are the same because we photoshopped it. We didn't. I'm a plant breeder. I can breed plants, magic, on the computer. Come on, that's another joke. That was a good one. All right, so there was a premium that people were willing to pay for alternatives to those black plastic pots. But really, we were interested in more than this. We were interested in what if we just label it as carbon intensive? We're not going to define what carbon intensive is, or carbon saving, or carbon neutral. We're just going to put a label on it and see what happens. So even if we put carbon saving, they were willing to pay 17 cents more. And if we said that there was some waste, not plastic waste, other waste. I don't know what, I'm not going to say what waste, right? So not plastic waste, but if there's waste in that container that was recycled, they're willing to pay 15 cents more. So you see what I'm talking about. Then I go out in the industry, and I tell growers, man, I have good news. It's awesome. People are willing to pay a premium for plastic, non-plastic pots. I go to Home Depot. Man, have I got good news. You have this Eco Options campaign. Look, we got pots out here, alternatives to plastic. People are willing to pay more for them, more for the plant that's in that pot. I go to Lowe's. I didn't go to Walmart, but I went to the other two. I tried to go to Walmart. They got all figured out. They don't need me. Guess what happened? Absolutely nothing. Zippo, nada. I mean, there's been a few growers that have tried it, but what it came down to was price. It came down to price. Exactly. The growers didn't want to pay more for the pot, and the retailers didn't want to have to pay the grower more for the plant that's in that pot. And so very few have even, only the growers that have done is those that sell to garden centers that get it and are emphasizing sustainability. All right, so, but again, part of the information is whether we use alternatives to plastic or whether we use plastic. We have to educate regarding our footprint, what the overall footprint is. And that it's not plastic waste. I really picked up on that. It's not plastic waste, that there's a residual value to even those products that we're recycling. All right, so I'm gonna quit right here. I think I'm probably right at my time limit. This last slide I bring up for a purpose. The biophilia that's innate in all of us means that we are inherently drawn to being in landscapes, gardens, plants. We love plants, and yet too many people walk around with plant blindness. The main course that I teach at Texas A&M's 336 students in that course. Only 8 of them are horticulture majors. The rest of them are from chemistry, history, all around campus. And I tell them when they come in, I have one purpose this semester, and that's to cure you of plant blindness. All right? Because there's so many people walking around with plant blindness. They see the plants, but they don't really see and understand the functional value of those plants. As an industry, I end every talk with this pitch that as an industry, we must emphasize the functional value of plants. We've got to talk about what it is we provide in terms of carbon footprint in order to justify, again, our access to water and other resources. So we're doing a better job of being sustainable. We didn't have this conference for nothing, but we all know that there's so much more that we could do, and there's so much more that we can do to impact the end consumer so that they recognize it and we take advantage of this biophilia on the part of the end consumer. Right? So we can tap into this, emphasize our positive carbon footprint, emphasize our almost positive water footprint, at least justify our existence, and hopefully make a little bit of money at the same time. Thank you very much.